This program helps parents understand more about ADHD and the impact it has on school achievement.
My parents were there supporting me.
It is a really hard challenge. It's a really hard thing to climb. And once you've overcome it, it's fine.
Just do what you can with it and just work with it.
In many parts of the world, it's likely that every classroom has at least one or two students who have been diagnosed with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, better known as ADHD. Up until recently, ADHD has been clinically diagnosed as a behavioral disorder. New research findings suggest that ADHD is associated with cognitive weaknesses that hinder learning. To learn more about this new research on ADHD, we look to Dr. Rosemary Tannock, Senior Scientist of the Brain and Behavior Research Program at the Hospital for Sick Children.
Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, often called ADHD for short, is a neurobiological condition that generally first appears in preschool years and early childhood. There are three main characteristics. First is symptoms of inattention, second, symptoms of hyperactivity, and third, symptoms of impulsivity. Currently, though, the medical system believes there are really just two main dimensions of symptoms, the inattentive symptoms and the hyperactive impulsive symptoms. And these could occur alone or in combination. And this gives rise to three subtypes that are recognized formally by the medical system.
There are three subtypes of ADHD: the hyperactive impulsive subtype, which is the least common subtype, and the combined and the inattentive subtypes, which are more prevalent. Classification into a particular subtype depends upon whether the child meets criteria for symptoms of hyperactivity, impulsivity, or symptoms of inattention, or both.
Combined type ADHD is actually the most common form of ADHD. It's often called classic ADHD. And about 50 to 70% of individuals with ADHD actually have combined type. These individuals and the children will manifest problems in both inattention and hyperactivity impulsivity, though in adolescence, the overt restlessness, hyperactivity won't necessarily be visible, rather it will be experienced as inner restlessness and need to be busy all the time. Some examples of types of symptoms would be these youngsters would have difficulty keeping their minds on one thing at a time, ignoring irrelevant information and keeping hold of what's really important, starting and completing work. Often they're called procrastinators. They don't get the work done. They could be constantly fidgeting in their seats. These are the kind of profile that you would see with a child with combined type ADHD. The main concern, however, from the teacher's perspective, is what we would term academic underachievement, often failing or at high risk for failing the grade despite good ability. And in particular, teachers often are concerned and parents are concerned because these youngsters have difficulty in math, in written expression, and key areas of the curriculum. For example, we've observed they use immature strategies such as finger counting, even though we know they know that those number facts. They might talk aloud as they're trying to work through the problem. They may be fidgety, distractible, go off task. As a result, they complete far, far less work.
Let's turn to look at the predominantly inattentive type ADHD. What's concerning is most are girls, and they go unnoticed. They're at risk of under-identification and under-treatment, in spite of cognitive and academic difficulties. This occurs because acting out behavior in class is much more noticeable and disruptive compared to the inattentive students' inner struggle to focus and concentrate.
Children with inattention, often referred to as the inattentive child, the inattentive subtype, are amongst the three subtypes of ADHD are the second most common. So about 25 to 35% of those with ADHD would meet criteria for the inattentive subtype. As implied by the name, these youngsters would have major problems in concentration, in in organizing the materials, often very forgetful, losing their things, forgetting even simple daily routines, such as forgetting to write down the homework in the agenda, in their homework agenda book, forgetting to take the book they need for homework, and even if they do the homework, often having it in their backpack but forgetting to hand it in. There is another slightly different profile that may also co-occur with this inattentive subtype, and that is the youngsters who are very daydreamy. They're often slow-moving, often described as in their own world, a bit space cadetish. And that's a slightly different profile, but it's still quite common. What we know is that girls in particular often meet the diagnostic criteria for this inattentive subtype, more often than boys. And girls in particular are overlooked and under-referred, and even when they are referred, they're underdiagnosed. And even, it's not really surprising if we think of the major difference between how girls manifest with their symptoms of ADHD versus boys. And that is, girls rarely exhibit the really overt disruptive type of symptoms of ADHD, so they're less likely to get out of their seat and race around the class. They'll be sitting at their desk, fidgeting, fiddling, not concentrating, daydreaming, but they're not disturbing anybody, and so don't draw attention to themselves. If they are referred, physicians also are less familiar with that type of profile, so may be less likely to confirm a diagnosis of ADHD. And finally, even if a girl with ADHD does receive the diagnosis, they are less likely to receive treatment, for example, with stimulant medication. So they really have much more likely than boys with ADHD to have their needs unmet, certainly in the medical community and also in the educational community. They're overlooked.
They didn't really go through exactly what it was that I had, and I didn't really know, so it was just hard to kind of understand. So I think it's, you know, you need someone to kind of sit there and go through it with you and tell you what it is. Also, I think self-confidence, too, was kind of hard because they kind of told you, like, what you couldn't do and what you can't do. And I don't know, like, basically when I took courses, I tried to take courses so that I could prove, like, I was told that I wasn't very good at math. And I took math courses to kind of improve, to show that I can do them, I can take it, so.
What advice would you give to someone who may have ADHD?
I think to kind of go out and seek help whenever you can, because I think that was my weakness, was I didn't know what was out there, and there are a lot of people out there willing to help you, especially like I had the teacher who kind of noticed and showed me the Learning Disability Center at Humber. My parents were there supporting me.
The diagnosis of ADHD is complex because there is no simple test. There is no blood test, no brain scan, no computer task we could give a child. But the criteria are specified. The medical discipline has a set of guidelines that is called the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, DSM for short. And it specifies the criteria that must be met for a diagnosis of ADHD. Specifically, at least 6 of 9 possible symptoms of inattention, or at least 6 of 9 possible symptoms of hyperactivity impulsivity. Moreover, there must be evidence that these symptoms began to appear before age 7. Also that they are persistent for at least 6 months. And also that they're pervasive, meaning they occur in many different contexts. For children, this would be typically home and school. And finally, that these symptoms must be impairing. And all of those criteria are required for evidence for a clinical diagnosis of ADHD. ADHD is a very common problem. So epidemiological studies from around the world have given estimates of 6 to 9%, as high as sometimes as 17%. But this means that it doesn't matter whether we looked at countries such as Japan, Australia, United Kingdom, any of the Scandinavian countries, North America, the rates are the same, extremely common. It means that about 1 in 20 children, or more importantly for teachers, about 1 or 2 children in every classroom will have ADHD. It's more common in boys, about 3 boys to every 1 girl. However, in clinical practice, there are typically many, many more boys referred, so that the rates are 7 boys to every 1 girl. And this is typically because boys are more overt in their behavior and draw attention to themselves, and so are they referred much more common and much more frequently than our girls. ADHD is so common that it has led several people to debate whether in fact ADHD is a real disorder. Perhaps the symptoms of ADHD are just an exaggerated response to everyday life, sensationalized and capitalized upon by medicine, education, the pharmaceutical industry, and that it really isn't a real disorder. However, what we do know is that ADHD is not new. It's been around a long, long time. In fact, the first description of problems that children had which are consistent with ADHD was in 1845 by a German physician, Dr. Heinrich Hoffmann, who wrote storybooks for his own children to keep them amused at bedtime. And he described cases from his clinic. And the first case, it is probably very widely known, called Fidgety Phil, little boy who couldn't sit still and in fact ended up falling off his chair. But less commonly known is there another type of presentation in the clinic. That is children who are inattentive. This is Johnny Head in the Air that Heinrich Hoffmann described as a daydreamy, little bit forgetful person who tended to fall over things. The first medical description was interpreted as a problem of moral control by Dr. George Still in 1902, who presented a series of lectures, and this is published in the medical journal called The Lancet. So the problem hasn't changed, just the names maybe have changed. Many people have thought that perhaps ADHD is due to bad parenting, and this simply is not the case. What we know is that ADHD tends to run in families. So if you have a child with ADHD, the parents of that child have a 2 to 8-fold increased risk of having ADHD themselves. The siblings have a 3 to 5-fold increased risk for having ADHD. If we look at twins, we know that if you have an identical twin, the other twin is highly likely to have ADHD compared to non-identical twins. But importantly, there is no genetic test at this point for ADHD. Some people have also suggested that ADHD might be caused by junk food, such as lots of sugar in the diet, food additives in the diet. And what the studies have consistently shown is there is no evidence that too much sugar causes ADHD. The situation is somewhat different for things like food additives, and a recent large-scale epidemiological study has examined the contribution of food additives, sugar, etc., in the diet of a large population of children. And what that study had found was that the increased food additives to the diet might somewhat increase the hyperactivity and concentration problems in all children. But that does not mean it causes ADHD. However, there are other environmental factors that may play a critical role, and one role is about maternal smoking during pregnancy. Children with ADHD are at least 2 times as likely to have had mothers who were smoking in pregnancy. And what we know from the research studies is that youngsters with ADHD may start smoking as early as 8. Moreover, they become habitual smokers at twice the rate of their peers. Why might this be the case? Well, to some extent speculation, but growing evidence, this may be what we call a self-medication hypothesis, that smoking allows them to perhaps concentrate more, to focus more, and perhaps that is why they're smoking. At one point, many physicians believed that children grew out of ADHD by their teenage years. However, we know that's not the case. ADHD continues in about 60 to 80% of children who receive a diagnosis continue to meet the diagnosis in adulthood years. What changes is how it manifests. And that is, with children, it manifests both as a lot of restlessness, hyperactive behavior, as well as inattention. However, across adolescence and into adulthood, Inattention is the primary feature, and the hyperactivity, the overt behavior, really diminishes and is experienced more as inner restlessness. If we think of the profile from preschool years right through into adolescent, there is a different emphasis of the concerns. In preschool years, youngsters with ADHD are already experiencing some cognitive difficulties. So these children, when they enter kindergarten, are already at a disadvantage, despite good ability. In preschool years, the major concerns are the youngster running around, bumping into things, getting into dangerous situations, perhaps having more injuries than other preschoolers. The primary concern in the school age years, in elementary school, is the hyperactive impulsive behavior, jumping out of seat, difficult to manage behavior. However, although that's the most salient problem, the real concern is the inattention, which is less, it's harder for people to see this. But what we know from research is that inattention is actually the strongest predictor of all of the cognitive difficulties that we know is associated with ADHD. So it's inattention that we get concerned about. Inattention, we know, also is associated with poor academic achievement, and academic underachievement is a major concern for school-age children. By contrast, as we shift into adolescence, yes, indeed, the problems continue with the difficulties of inattention, the inner restlessness. The complaints have been that the children are less motivated in their schoolwork, but there are also more concerning issues as well. And what we know about adolescence is the concern about driving. ADHD doesn't disappear when the youngster gets behind the wheel. And that is, we know from the research that youngsters with ADHD are about 4 to 6 times more likely to have serious road traffic accidents, car crashes, of which they are the cause.
Stephen, you have attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, right?
Yes.
They call ADHD. What part of that do you understand that you have? And how does it affect you?
I know that it affects my learning abilities, my attention span, of course. It's like with geography. Sometimes it takes me a lot longer to learn that because I'm not really interested in it. Even when I want to listen, it's just goes through my head.
What are some of the things, though, that you've found that your teachers have worked with you? And is there a particular teacher that's made a real difference?
I would say Miss Taylor, because she was one of the only teachers that actually related to me. She actually knew that what I felt about science and how she was teaching it, and she actually changed it to fit, to make it so that I would be able to listen to it and everything.
Do you use some sort of summary book, like for studying for tests?
For studying for tests, I take the stuff that I'm supposed to be studying for, and I write it down into a summary form, and then I read off of that. That is how I study.
Can you lead a band?
No.
Are you a big liar?
Yes.
To learn all these lines in this play, Music Man, how did you even begin to learn all those? By just saying it over and over and over?
Yeah, it was anytime when I had my book with me, I just read it. I'm a conservatory man myself. Gary, Indiana, gold class of Lot 5.
If someone found out they had ADHD and they were kind of all upset about it, what would you say to them?
I would say make the best of it. Just do what you can with it and just work with it.
What we know now is that ADHD is more than just the behavioral symptoms that we can see. It's more than meets the eye. What we know from neuroimaging studies is that there are subtle differences in the structure of certain parts of the brain. For example, the cerebellum, which is important for precise timing and coordinated movement, is altered in ADHD. Also, the prefrontal cortex, which is essential for planning and organization, as well as for working memory, which controls attention and resists distraction, is altered in ADHD. Furthermore, the neural networks that connect the various parts of the brain interact differently in people with ADHD. So if we are to understand individuals with ADHD and to help them, it is essential that we understand their cognitive difficulties. And a particular difficulty I want to focus on is working memory. Working memory is often referred to as an active mental workspace. It's a cognitive system that allows us to hold and manipulate information online for a few seconds during problem solving or other cognitive activities. And it's this internal representation in working memory that we use to guide our decision making, so that behavior and actions are not dominated by immediate sensory cues in the environment. Let me give you a couple of real-world examples. The cocktail party. It's quite amazing that we can be in a busy environment with everybody chatting at a party, and we can concentrate and focus on the conversation at hand. That is until some salient little bit of information captures our attention and draws us away, such as one's name. And although this phenomenon has been known for some time, recently scientists have gone back to investigate this aspect. And what they found is that it's actually only about a third of the population whose attention is drawn away by their name. About the third, in fact, that have been shown for some reason to have a more limited working memory capacity. That is, they're less able to filter out that distracting information. What we know about working memory, therefore, is that it provides this continual, online, updated source of information that allows us to resist distraction, to focus on the relevant information in more complex activities in everyday life, such as following a conversation, reading comprehension, following a complex set of instructions, planning ahead, all require working memory.
And so, to recap, ADHD has a genetic basis. ADHD persists into adulthood. ADHD is a neurocognitive disorder, not just a behavioral disorder. Inattention is associated with poor academic performance. And working memory is one cognitive impairment in ADHD that is important in education. What we've learned is that children with ADHD have difficulties processing and organizing information. Acknowledging these challenges will make life a lot easier at home and at school. Clearly, success at school requires a home and school partnership, which encourages two-way communication to help achieve long-term success.